We've come this week to the second in our series about stretched faith, which looks at some of the chapters of the Old Testament book of Daniel. Last week, Eve introduced us to Daniel, his friends, and the world in which they live. This morning, through the lens of acoustic faith, grounded in the learned art of listening, we shall see that Daniel, as he adjusted to his new life in Babylon, he did so with his ears open. He had a faith that listened. He engaged fully with the world around him. Willing to learn, he consciously sought to immerse himself in his new context and culture. He embraced a foreign education, became fluent in a language that wasn't his own. He developed a huge capacity to listen to those around him. He had an acoustic faith. However, the key to Daniel's faith, seen in his wisdom, his discernment, his confidence and his trust in God, his capacity to bring God's message of life in all its fullness to the very centre of this powerful kingdom, even to the king himself, was built not just on his extraordinary determination to listen to the world in which he lived. The essence of his success was double listening. He had one ear tuned to the voices of Babylon, but the other ear was listening to the voice of God. Daniel's faith was acoustic, but he also did double listening. As followers of Jesus, our faith calls us to listen both to the voice of our culture and context, as well as to the voice of God. Our passage this morning, Daniel chapter 2, is set in the early years of the exile of God's people in Babylon. Eve introduced us last week to the political background that God used to challenge and change his people. Babylon, the Middle Eastern superpower of the time, had invaded the land of Judah, captured Jerusalem, and carried off both the treasures of the temple, the centre of worship of God, as well as the influential and elite people from the city to Babylon. We're going to listen to our Bible reading now. It comes from Daniel chapter 2, and Tracy will begin reading at verse 1.
Daniel 2. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Now to verse 10. The astrologers answered the king, There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among the humans. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, Why did the king issue such a harsh decree? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went to the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven. Now to verse 24. Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, "Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him." Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dreams mean." The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you were lying in bed are these."
Thank you, Tracy. King Nebuchadnezzar has been disturbed by a very vivid dream. However, neither he nor the wise men of Babylon can understand what it's all about. At this point, Daniel enters the story. Through prayer, he's able to discern the dream and its meaning, both of which he then communicates to the king. The king's dream is a direct message from God showing him the future of his kingdom. As the second half of Daniel chapter 2 shows, Daniel explains how the imagery of the destruction of this enormous, awesome, dazzling statue, made variously of iron and bronze and clay, silver and gold, showed that kingdoms would fall and kingdoms would rise. That the God of heaven, signified by the rock in the dream, would bring about a kingdom that, unlike the others, would not pass away. A kingdom that would endure forever. Nebuchadnezzar is so persuaded by Daniel's interpretation that he honours, rewards and promotes Daniel. But even more incredibly, the king proclaims, as we read in verse 47, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." At the heart of Daniel's faith is a remarkable capacity to listen. His faith is stretched between the twin tasks of, on one hand, listening to the voice of God, and on the other, the voice of the culture in which he finds himself living. Being a disciple of Jesus requires of us both. We're perhaps more comfortable with acknowledging that Daniel, by God's gifting, was able to hear God's word and pass it on to those around him, not least of all the king of Babylon. The temptation here, however, is that we identify this gift as an entirely spiritual one, or maybe we could say something that's otherworldly, not connected to the real world in which we live. But life as a Christian can never be so entirely one-sided. As followers of Jesus, we stand with our feet firmly anchored in two worlds. Daniel would not have been able to speak into the world around him unless he'd first listened. Right from the start, he and his companions strained to hear the voices of the city, the whispers of hopes and desires, the sighs of pain and hurting, the murmurings of discontent, the cries of need and longing. Here, in his one-to-one engagement with Nebuchadnezzar the king, there is substantial evidence that he understands. He knows, he gets where people are coming from. He's got the rhythm of the city. His faith, his living for God, his service and wisdom is born out of double listening. One ear open to the God who speaks to women and men, and the other ear open to the women and men to whom God will speak. Daniel's faith, his living for God, his service of Yahweh, is not based on the proclamation of disembodied truths, disconnected from context and culture. Rather, he speaks, he lives, he loves on God's behalf in a way that connects with the hopes and desires, the anxieties and fears of the people amongst whom he lives. Daniel is listening for the voice of God, the revealer of mysteries. His desire is to hear God, whether through the daily drudgery of life or the dramatic revelation of a dream. He's tuned his hearing into God. He's chosen to learn how to listen for the God of gods and the Lord of kings to speak. He wants to hear God, be it through scripture, through intuition, through observation, or the strange dream of a foreign king. Daniel's faith, his relationship with God, his ability to live, to thrive in this foreign land is grounded in double listening. A faith that hears the whisper of God in a diverse and different culture and context. A faith that grapples with affirming and challenging, questioning and answering, but at all times is seeking to point others towards the God who brings life in all its fullness. He connects, he contacts, he communicates, he converses, he communes with the culture and context. He's not detached. He's not isolated, not withdrawn, not silent, not independent, not seeking to live in a world that as it once was. The life-giving gospel of Jesus, the good news of the Christian faith is about love, and love begins with listening. Listening creates trust. Listening says, I want to understand. Listening shows authenticity. Listening affirms that I don't know. Listening says that you are important. Daniel had listened. He'd literally learned the language of Babylon. He'd sought to understand culture and history and context. Acoustic faith also requires us to communicate the story, to respond. Daniel was called to communicate in word and action and deed the story of the God of gods and the Lord of kings. The story, the narrative, the history of the people of God, through which and in which the character and nature of God himself could be seen. Daniel, despite all that he'd learned, was not to update or change the story of God to make it more palatable, to be less challenging, to be more acceptable, but to discern the points of contact. Here in chapter 2, Daniel's task is to engage with this ambitious king Nebuchadnezzar, who has placed himself very firmly in the centre of the unfolding history around him. He was to engage with him so he can persuade him that he too is subject to the God of gods and the Lord of kings. How does this young man from the elite of Jerusalem speak for God in the royal courts of Babylon? Daniel must remain faithful to the story of God, but at the same time be creative. His faith must be true to the oldness of the story, but also the newness of his context. The images and illustrations will be different, but the intrinsic message will stay the same. Like Daniel, our faith is stretched between the constant content of God's message of love and of grace, of forgiveness, of holiness and justice, and the cultural context of the world in which we live. A brilliant New Testament example of acoustic faith, of double listening, is to be found in Acts chapter 17. Paul finds himself in Athens. He walks around the city, the places of worship, the cultural centres, and he listened, he watched, he observed. He doesn't start with preaching, with proclaiming the good news of Jesus. He allows the city and its people to get under his skin. He wants to know, he wants to understand. And when he has an opportunity to speak, his words are authentic. He speaks with empathy. His proclamation of Jesus starts from a place shaped by his listening. Let me read you some words from Acts chapter 17, verse 22. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." We learn to listen. We learn to double listen to the voice of God and to the world around us. Then we respond. Then we communicate the story of God we respond in love. What principles then can we pull out from the experiences of Daniel and Paul that will help us develop an acoustic faith? Firstly, let me suggest it's about making listening a priority. Both Daniel in Babylon and Paul in Athens grasp that in our task of sharing God's love and grace and hope with others, we have to, yes, speak, but we also have to listen. So often the words that we associate with communicating the gospel are outward in terms of the flow of communication. A few moments ago, I spoke about sharing, but we often use plenty of other verbs: proclaiming, preaching, telling, speaking. And all are appropriate in communicating the good news of Jesus. But we all know that a message really hits home when it's been formed and shaped by listening to the aspirations and hopes, the anxieties and the doubts, the joy and the pain of those with whom we are communicating. As followers of Jesus, we're called to both speak into and out of our cultures. I wonder how our relationship with others would change, how our communication would be enhanced, how many more opportunities we might have to speak to people about the God of gods and the Lord of kings if we made listening a priority. Sharing our faith in words or actions, evangelism is not something that we do to people. It's not a process or a project that we simply need to find the most culturally creative way to make it happen. Our passion and our priority, and please hear me correctly, is not in some nebulous, disconnected gospel. Our passion and therefore our priority is people. If we love people and we want the best for them, we will want to be able to communicate with them, to live, to share the message of hope that is to be found in Jesus. To do this, we must be people that first listen. And also we must choose to listen to God. A conscious decision to spend time in God's presence. Yes, God is always there with us. However, it's good to consciously give Him time to listen to His voice, to acknowledge, to get to know Him better through His Word and His Spirit. Eve spoke last week about the helpful habits that Daniel put into place. And as we read on through the book of Daniel, we will see how spending time in God's presence was crucial to who He was and the way that He lived His life. We need to listen to God, to be aware of His presence, for it is He that is at work in His world. It is He that's calling women and men to Himself. It is He that through His Spirit is making Jesus known. We need to listen for His voice. Look for where He is at work. Seek to hear Him at work in others, to work with what God is doing. We need to prioritise listening. Secondly, I suggest we must choose to develop our listening skills. We must learn to listen. To do this, we need to maybe rediscover that listening is both a gift and a learned activity. A gift in the sense that God gives us the ability to hear the cry of the human heart, the empathy to seek, to see, to hear, to understand the situation from the other's perspective. It's a gift from our Creator God that we can ask that He would give to us. But it's also a learned activity. Like every God-given gift, we have a choice to strengthen it or to stifle it. We can work on it or we can waste it. Our response will very much be impacted by how important we think that gift is. We can learn to be better listeners. Perhaps we need to acknowledge that we're not as good as we like to think that we are. Maybe we need to ask God about this. Maybe we need to ask a good friend, how am I at listening? Do I say too much? Am I uncomfortable with silences? Do I always need to give to fill the space that's there? Maybe we need to admit that we don't value this gift as much as we should. for it doesn't make us look good. It takes too much time. It means that I can't share my knowledge and my learning with others. Maybe we need to seek God's forgiveness and ask for his help to change us. But it's also about being practical. It's about putting listening into practice. As we seek to get to know our friends, our family, our neighbours, our colleagues, what makes them tick, we need to listen to them and to listen to God as well. Praying, asking him that he would help us be courageous. He would help us know where he is at work. Living as a follower of Jesus requires a faith that stretches, an acoustic faith. A faith that listens both to God and to those around us and sees the importance of listening to others as we live and share and are the love of God to the world around us.